Our government is increasing our ongoing commitment to funding for sexual and reproductive health rights. We will be raising our funding to $1.4 billion annually.
Dear Mr. Trudeau, my name is Zuri and I live in Ethiopia. I heard about your announcement today.
$1.4 billion.
Why is there so much cheering about bringing these foreign ideas to my community?
$700 million of the annual investment dedicated to sexual and reproductive health rights.
Can't you see that many of my friends can't even go to school?
We can help women access birth control.
That some of us don't have enough food to eat.
It's essential that these women have access to modern contraception.
That my father can't find work.
As well as sexual education and prevention services.
Why then, I ask, are they cheering?
Canada is doubling its current investment to help close existing gaps in reproductive rights.
In 2017, Justin Trudeau marked International Women's Day by committing $650 million of Canada's annual foreign aid towards sexual and reproductive health and rights, a euphemism for abortion, sterilization, and sexuality education.
And that, Mr. Speaker, includes the right to safe and accessible abortions.
That same year, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister proudly proclaimed that sexual and reproductive rights, particularly abortion, are at the core of Canada's foreign policy. Let that sink in. Abortion, the deliberate termination of a human being before birth. At the core of our foreign policy, to the tune of billions of dollars.
This is about what we need to achieve in the world to promote our values.
And in February 2020, Minister of International Development, Karina Gould, said this: "A woman's right to choose and her ability to access family planning and safe abortions is fundamental to achieving a more equitable, a more peaceful, and a more prosperous world." Abortion for a more peaceful and prosperous world? And it doesn't end there. Even during a worldwide pandemic, millions of COVID-19 relief dollars were earmarked for abortion in developing nations.
The last thing Canadians expect is for me to come down and lecture another country on how they choose to govern themselves.
Why is it then that the Canadian government continues to fund organizations and special interest groups with hundreds of millions of dollars per year, pressuring African countries to legalize abortion?
No, abortion is not a human right. Abortion is not in any way universally accepted.
Obianuju Ekeocha is an internationally acclaimed strategist, speaker, author, and filmmaker. She was born and raised in southeastern Nigeria.
I never dreamt that I would be in a position where I'm going into different African countries, trying to find out exactly how the different Western nations, foundations, and Western organizations are affecting African women's lives.
Her award-winning documentary, Strings Attached, exposes the ideological colonization that Canada is guilty of under the leadership of Justin Trudeau.
I don't think that any Western country has a right to pay for abortions in an African country, especially where majority of people don't want abortion.
She understands that these may be the values of the Canadian Prime Minister.
The commitment that this government has made to stand up and defend reproductive rights at every single opportunity is one that sticks in their craw, Mr. Speaker.
But these are not the same values held by an overwhelming majority of African nations.
In fact, many Africans turn up their noses when you tell them that, some Western country has made this large budget for sexual and reproductive health and rights. People wonder, well, can they see that we don't even have food to eat?
Trudeau's obsession with abortion on demand is well documented in Canada.
There are certain groups that are specifically dedicated to fighting abortion rights for women, and that is wrong. We will defend women's rights regardless of what folks in certain religious groups try to push us against.
But with most Canadians divided on this issue, why are our tax dollars funding and promoting it throughout the African continent?
So who is the government of Canada trying to excite or to please?
David Mulroney spent 32 years in the Canadian Foreign Service. He was Canada's ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2009 to 2012 and served as Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and personal representative to the G8 summit. His book about Canada-China relations won the J.W. Defoe Prize for 2016.
It sounds a little as if they're trying to please their like-minded allies in the UN and some of the major foundations that also see abortion as the solution to all of Africa's problems.
As one of Canada's leading experts on foreign policy, he's convinced that our country is in some ways acting like the coercive China, which he knows all too well.
China is right now in the midst of a major and appalling crackdown on religious freedom. There's an enormous effort to really remove religion from their society and from other parts of Chinese society.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China. Their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime.
No one is suggesting that Canada is using the same kind of violent and illegal means that China sometimes uses in its coercive diplomacy. But the use of money and the power and leverage of money is in many ways the same.
No country should be able to come into another country and make their own dictates, make their own demands, or push the power of their money or their wealth.
Over the next 90 minutes, David Mulroney and Obianuju Ekeocha unpack the Canadian government's obsession with spreading the ideology of abortion in Obsessed, Canada's Coercive Diplomacy.
Hello, my name is David Mulroney, and I'm someone who's spent the bulk of my professional career in the Canadian Foreign Service and serving as a diplomat overseas, focused on China, and focused particularly on China's growing relationship with Canada and the wider world. Lately, though, I, along with a lot of other Canadians, have been increasingly concerned about China's growing assertiveness and its growing tendency to try to influence events in other countries, including Canada. We've seen this in many ways, most crudely and disturbingly through the detention of 2 Canadian citizens in an effort by China to get us to release a senior financial executive from a Chinese telecoms company who's part of an extradition request with the United States. But China's influence works on us in other ways too. Partly it's China's growing economic clout that leads us to suppress ideas, not to speak about things that we should be speaking about, like China's human rights abuses, and encourages us to go along with China's ideas, whether they're good ideas or not. So if China is interested in the Canadian Arctic, we welcome that interest. If China has aspirations to host the Olympic Games, despite the fact that it's a major human rights abuser, we stay silent. We've also seen this affected through what's referred to as elite capture, where China uses financial inducements to influence Canadian opinion leaders through things like lucrative board memberships or consulting contracts. So all of this sees China trying to influence the Canadian agenda, influence Canadian policy, and in some respects influence Canadian society itself. And it's, as I say, very worrying. Today we're going to discuss 4 topics. First, what constitutes good foreign aid? Second, what are the new directions in Canada's foreign aid? And do these constitute good foreign aid? 3, how is this playing out in Africa, which is the largest destination for our foreign aid dollars? And 4, what should Canadians be doing about this? I also, of course, try to keep track of other issues, and stay abreast of wider foreign policy issues for Canada. And one of the people that I follow very closely and respect greatly is the Nigerian-born human rights activist, thinker, writer, Obianuju Ekeocha. My wife and I even had the opportunity to hear her speak when she was in Canada most recently. And one of the things that has really captivated me about Obianuju's work is her focus on what she refers to as a new kind of colonialism. It's an ideological colonialism through which countries in the West, rich, powerful countries, including Canada, are seeking to impose their will on Africa and African nations, to change the discussions there, to change policy, even to change the structure of society itself. And as I think about Obianuju Ekeocha's work and what she's doing and saying, it leaves me with the uncomfortable feeling that the coercive diplomacy that we accuse China of activating on Canada may in fact be something that Canada is doing in Africa, that we too may be guilty of coercive diplomacy, that we too may be guilty of a form of ideological colonization. I have the great honor of being able to ask the Obianuju Ekeocha directly today about this. And before I start, I want to ask if whether I might, in addressing you, you are known as Obianuju Ekeocha in your work, in your writing, in your speaking, but might I use the more familiar diminutive Uju in addressing you? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, David. Absolutely. You can call me Uju.
Well, thank you, Uju. Do I have it right? Am I doing justice to your thinking when it comes to this new form of colonization, this ideological colonization, and Canada's role in it?
Indeed, David, you perfectly just summarized the bulk of my work, or the main thrust of my work in the last couple of years, the so-called ideological neocolonialism that we have seen from many Western countries who are relating one-on-one with different African countries, and Canada being right now at the very top of that list. We have seen them doing this more recently, and it keeps growing, and they keep stepping down on the accelerator on this neocolonialism. But I don't even know if majority of Canadians realize exactly how their government is doing this and where exactly they're doing it.
Well, let's dig into this more deeply. In my experience, good foreign aid, like good diplomacy, depends on three important things. The first is listening. You can't help solve the problems of a recipient country, a country to which you're sending aid, if you don't understand those problems, and if you don't hear about those problems from their perspective, the impact it has on their economy, but also on their society, even right down to family life. So you've got to be a good listener. The second thing that's required is a large dose of modesty and humility. Because if you are an aid donor, it's very easy to slip into the I know best trap, the idea that you have all the answers and the lowly aid recipient is merely waiting for you to share your wisdom. That can lead you very much in the wrong direction. And the third characteristic of good aid is that it is transitional. That in whatever you do, your medium to long-term objective is to help the recipient country get off aid dependency. That you're enabling it to stand on its own 2 feet. That's successful aid. And I worry, Uju, from what you've said in particular, that these characteristics are notably missing from Western aid to Africa in general and Canadian aid in particular.
That's exactly right, David. It is true that there is real need in Africa. I am not here today to disparage that or to cast any doubt or to say, indeed, Africa doesn't need aid. Anyone who has followed international news or who has had their pulse on events around the world would know that there is indeed need. We have healthcare systems and educational systems and even our security systems that all all need help. And there are many African countries that are struggling from point of view of economics, from point of view of infrastructure. So we do need aid. But the concerning thing and the disheartening thing is that in the last couple of decades, we've seen it more and more that Western donors come in, and just as you enumerated so perfectly, they are not listening to the Africans, who indeed have their own thoughts and their own opinions as to how they can come out of the poverty that is so widespread in so many places. They're not being humble. These donors are not being humble. They are, yes, the ones who come with the large, and deep pockets and the large funding, but they are not really listening to us. Sometimes it's as if they have already made up their minds, they have written up these plans, and they have drawn out the entire blueprint of what needs to happen before they even come to us. And of course, many of them, unfortunately, are also having no thoughts whatsoever on. They're not talking about leaving Africa, doing this transitional work where they are setting Africa up to stand on our own. The African nations, I always think about the African nations as someone who has been on life support and someone who has been on oxygen, but do they really need life support? Is it that bad that we should be on a permanent oxygen from the West? So our donors are having absolutely no thought whatsoever as to how we can come off the life support that they have put us on, how we can stand on our own 2 feet, and how we can in fact thrive. It's very, very painful that happens, but also so much worse that they come in addition with these things where they're not listening, they're not being humble, they don't have any thoughts of their work being transitional. They also come already very ideological. So a lot of our donors come with an entire set of ideological views, ideological values on so many issues. And so they are trying to, not only are they not listening to us, but they are really trying to create another region in their own image and likeness. So someone comes with their ideology, you see the Africans, they consider us like a cultural vacuum. These are some of the problems that we've seen. And again, as I said, in my work, it's so disheartening to go around and speak to people in different African countries. People know that, people notice it, and it's just the paternalism is incredible. And that's where I'm hoping that by the end of our discussion today, perhaps one extra person would have learned and seen what good aid is meant to be like, or what should have been so good for the African people from the perspective of the Africans. Perhaps, many people would listen to us, perhaps many more people would think about it, but there definitely is a way that Canada and indeed other Western donors can help African countries in a way that it's not harmful to us, but rather helpful.
Uju, thank you for that, because as difficult as your message is for this Canadian, you also remind us all that we should have in our hearts a sense of optimism for Africa, a sense of confidence in African solutions. And we should understand the fact that there is a very healthy pride in Africa that we should be building on and respecting. So, thank you. The first thing to know about how Canadian aid is delivered is that it's delivered through the Canadian International Development Agency, which is what I would refer to as a bureaucracy in a bubble. It's full of hardworking and well-intentioned people, but over the last few decades, the driving force in foreign aid internationally has been almost an international competition to see who can do the best job of meeting the global goal, the goal for developing countries of spending 0.7% of their gross national income on foreign aid. Now that's a laudable goal, it's a good thing, but sometimes when you're driven by a money target, you get more focused on spending money than on how the money is spent. And many times we've seen in recent years that CIDA has struggled with this. It becomes a bureaucracy that is trying to spend money by writing checks to foreign agencies, to the United Nations, to foundations, to get as much money out of the door as possible. And this is where the bubble comes in. Because instead of making these decisions in Africa, decisions about Africa are actually made now in Silicon Valley, at the United Nations in New York, in Geneva and Brussels and London. And our aid officials in Canada are speaking to bureaucrats who think very much like them in all of these places and making important decisions about Africa. So that's been the direction. But the big news in Canada is that in the last few years, there has been a radical new direction in our foreign aid, as there has been a radical new direction in our foreign policy. And I would ask you, Uju, if you can help explain that for folks.
Right. So, of course, there was a change in administration in Canada, something that anybody who works in this area, who is monitoring humanitarian aid, who is monitoring how African nations are relating with Western countries, it's always important to note what happens during a shift in administration or during a change in administration. So I noticed that once the Trudeau administration came into office, there were lots of announcements about different changes that were going to happen, particularly to humanitarian aid, to how Canada deals with foreign aid, to how Canada relates to the African countries and funds different projects. So I noticed, of course, just like probably everyone else who was paying attention, that the Canadian government, first and foremost, took one of the most important funding streams that Canada had going towards African countries, the Muskoka Initiative, which had to do a lot with maternal health and the health of the newborn and the health of pregnant women and so on and so forth, and started to redefine it and change it and change the most important elements of it. We also noticed as well, those of us who were observing, that the Canadian government, the new administration that is, came up with this thing that we're calling the feminist foreign policy, something I must say that I have never seen with any other Western donor, with any other Western country. So this was very new to us. But following the announcement of these different changes, we then noticed what actually it entailed. What does it mean when the Canadian government speaks about foreign policy or the feminist foreign policy, something, again, completely new, completely made up, if you like. But don't forget that they're dealing with Africans. They are dealing with African countries that within their own minds and within their own mindset have their own views and values on the family, their own views and values on motherhood, for example, their own views and values on women in society. The Canadians then came to us with something that had already been preconceived and written up in Western countries, in the minds of feminists, in the heart of the feminist movement that is largely Western, if I could put it that way. But what made it terrible or unfortunate is that it's not only that the Canadian government is bringing in this Western conceived idea or ideal of feminism or their own definition of what feminism is. The Canadian government brought it in with a force of money. So the kind of millions and millions of dollars that the Canadian government was able to put behind this whole agenda, this thing they're calling the feminist foreign policy, and that's exactly how they are dealing with African countries. So imagine the tilt of power going towards the Canadian government that has all the money, has all the control, but also, mind you, as we had mentioned earlier, they had already conceived everything they were going to do in African countries, everything that they think is the best way to proceed with the Muskoka Initiative, which was one of Canada's selling points as far as relationship with other countries is concerned. The Canadians were funding, the maternal health. They were helping women who were giving birth to children, giving money to to causes that would take care of the neonates. But the new Canadian government decided that as part of the maternal health, the Muskoka Initiative was going to be something like abortion, and also something like adolescent family planning. This is all language that has come directly from your government's website as far as some of these agenda would be concerned. So it's how we've seen the Canadian government, how they have dealt with African countries, the Africans themselves. I think it's a little bit confusing because for a lot of these African countries, we have our way of life, we have our, how our society flows. There are gaps, of course, as far as finance is concerned, and as far as poverty is widespread. But it doesn't mean that we don't know what it means, to respect motherhood. It doesn't mean that we don't have our own thoughts as to how women are supposed to be the real heart of the home within society. The Africans already have their thoughts and their views and values on these issues, but the Canadian government comes around with the force of money, and they are coming with their ideologies all already made up. This is how you know a donor who doesn't care about what the receiver or the recipient is thinking or how their way of life is. They just come in to impose upon us something that they have already preconceived in Ottawa and in Toronto.
Uju, that's shocking. And from a Canadian perspective, what's most shocking is how blatant we've been about this, how clear we've been in messaging that this is exactly what we're going to do. I remember the statement from then Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland, where she talked about feminist international assistance, and she couldn't have been clearer in signaling that from here on in, Canadian foreign aid would be based not on listening mode, but on broadcast mode. Regardless of what a country in Africa might need or want, what we're saying now is what you're going to get from us is abortion. And that's shocking. And we've got hundreds of millions of dollars a year to spend to make sure that that happens. And as we've seen in elections in the West, in Canada and the United States, big budgets can actually help to sway opinions, and they can also help to change how society makes its judgments, how things like the family are seen. And that's precisely what we intend to do in Africa. There was a document that was released at the time of the announcement, these were answers to frequently asked questions, where we made explicit that it's just that kind of influence shaping, that kind of influence operation that we intend to use some of this money for.
Exactly, David. What you've said now about your former foreign minister at the time these announcements were made is quite telling. That's exactly what we saw. We saw a donor coming to African nations to say this is exactly what we are ready to spend on. As you called it, the broadcast mode. They went on the broadcast mode. There's absolutely nothing about them listening or asking the Africans exactly what they think they want or what they need within their societies, of course, which we would know best because we're the ones in those situations. But there was something else I picked up from her statement, the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights, which she had referenced, talking about the way Canadian funding was now going to be administered and where the funding stream was going to be flowing. The sexual and reproductive health and rights, for anybody who reads some of these UN documents, the resolutions and things that have happened over the last few decades, sexual and reproductive health and rights has now become a signal, a code that really means when you broaden it and open it up and unpack it, it really means all that have to do with abortion and the so-called comprehensive sexuality education and population control in some regards. Sexual and reproductive health and rights has become a real code, and it's something that a lot of Western countries have picked up, and it's really in line with their own ideas and ideologies. But when you come to African countries, that's another ball game. As a matter of fact, many of our African diplomats who work around the United Nations do have a problem with the sexual and reproductive health and rights. Why? Because it's been defined. It's all been defined by Western donors, by Western countries. And how do we then say we have consensus when Western countries are rallying around this particular term that they have come up with to include all of these issues that are actually in line with their own ideologies? So sexual and reproductive health and rights being the core of the funding, the new type of funding that is now being given by the Canadian government, is a real problem. They also mentioned abortion at the time of the announcement. The Canadian government was very keen and very clear to the fact that they are now going to be making all efforts to make sure that abortion is accessible and abortion is abortion is provided in all of these countries where they were funding things. But anybody who also would want to ask the question, abortion is actually not legal in many of the African countries. And it's not legal in many of the African countries, not because these Africans are so backwards and we don't know what abortion is and we cannot go out and get abortion. We all have our parliaments, we have our legislative bodies, we have the executive, and we could go through the entire process of passing a bill, of making it law and getting abortion if we want. But the point of the matter is that in most of the African countries, wherever the poll or the survey has been done, overwhelming majority of people in these African countries are saying no to abortion. The Africans themselves are rejecting abortion from the point of view of their cultural heritage and their cultural beliefs. So imagine that a donor is then coming towards us, like the Canadians, and saying to us, this is now where our funding is going to be centered around the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights, the abortion access and how accessible abortion is, and the funding of abortion and the lobbying for abortion. You are bringing this to a group of people who already have very strong views as far as, society-wide. This is something that is absolutely rejected by most people in society. What are you telling us to say that you are going to be funding this particular issue in all of these African countries, in places where they have other needs, particularly things that have to do with real healthcare, education, infrastructure, all the things that people in various African communities are asking for. And the Canadian government makes an announcement that is all about sexual and reproductive health and rights and the funding of this particular ideological agenda. So it's incredible.
Uju, as you speak, I can feel your indignation and your sense of outrage. And then I reflect on how I would feel if another country said, we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to, quote unquote, address social norms in Canada, in other words, to change them, and to eliminate the judicial and legal barriers that are the laws that the Canadian people have set up to govern their society. We would be outraged too. We would be indignant too. So I get it.
Exactly. People in Western countries will completely understand, just like you have now, what I'm speaking about. No country should be able to come into another country and make their own dictates, make their own demands, or push the power of their money or their wealth. You had right at the beginning referenced China, and people have seen it in some regards in many countries where they have a lot of dealings with China. This is what we are seeing in African countries. I know that Canada has this almost like a moral high ground where they stand, and the Canadians may not even be able to conceive it within their minds that the Canadian government is then appearing as this neo-colonial master who is coming and making demands and coming and making requests. But that's exactly how it is when you think of the fact that these African countries have rejected some of these ideological points that our Western donors have, and their own priorities and their own agenda. The African countries do not want to have anything to do with any of those things, but simply for the mere fact that we are on a lower ground as far as money is concerned, as far as funding is concerned. It's a horrible thing to see another country coming in and taking control like that, and coming in and pushing their will in that way, and giving nothing but more strength and power to those who are on the margin against the will of the majority of the people. So anyone who is in the West and who understands all about the sovereignty of a nation will understand exactly why I am unhappy about this. And most of people in Africa who know what is going on are actually indignant about it as well. It's a terrible thing and a very unfortunate thing, but that's where the African countries have found themselves, because that's where the Canadian government has now willed to go. The Canadian government is going by ideology, and they are ready to use their money to buy their way, if possible. No
one is suggesting that Canada is using the same kind of violent and illegal means that China sometimes uses in its coercive diplomacy. But the use of money and the power and leverage of money is in many ways the same. And so too is the disrespect that it shows for the partner, the other country. This is coming home.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that is true. Absolutely. So the Canadians, just for some, so that nobody will get me wrong, yes, the Canadians are not doing all the things that China is doing in terms of the abusing of human rights and the rights of the people. But in some ways, it is even more insidious, because if China comes in with all of their tactics and all of their strategies, they're easily recognizable, and people can push back and say, we know what you are trying to do. We have seen you doing it before, But the Canadians are the nice guys, if I can put it that way. Growing up in Nigeria, which is in West Africa, I have always thought about Canada as the nice ones, the kind ones. The Canadians are the humble ones. This is how I have perceived Canada, and this is how a lot of people from the society that I come from, how we have always seen Canada, the ones who would stand and listen, So it is so much more insidious that one who has been perceived as a friend for so many years, all of a sudden then comes back still looking nice, still smiling, but then the difference is that the entire list of things that they want to do and the things that they want to achieve in our countries is now completely different. And the fact that they come with so much money, sometimes it's actually more dangerous than a friend comes to you with something that is ideologically driven, even if they are not being forcefully coercive, as some other people may have been in the past or some other people are now doing. But the Canadian government has, they do have the advantage, the fact that Canada has such a good name right across the continent, and Canada is so well trusted. But unfortunately, their ideology is dangerous for our people, and we are now beginning to see it. It's only been a few years, but already we are seeing in so many places the effects of that.
One of the things that might surprise Canadians when it comes to the delivery of our foreign aid in Africa is that we don't have teams of Canadian aid workers working with African partners. As I said at the outset, a lot of our aid is delivered to Africa via Silicon Valley or New York or London. And Uju, I was wondering if you could say a few words about who our partners are. Who are the people who are getting these checks to carry out the feminist international aid policy that we've so proudly announced? Right.
So a lot of people who are taxpayers in Canada may not in fact realize, as we talk about it, and even people on the African side of things, who exactly is helping Canada to achieve their goals and their so-called feminist foreign policy. It's the third party. One, it's not Canadians. Two, it's not the Africans themselves. Then who's doing it? A lot of this is coming from the United States, it's coming from the United Kingdom. So organizations like Marie Stopes International, a London headquartered organization that is running out of the United Kingdom, is running out of a London office, is actually a major partner to Canada as far as the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights is concerned. Marie Stopes International, for those who don't know, is this organization that has been so riddled with scandal and by scandal. Here in the United Kingdom, they have had problems with a care commission that regulates organizations like Marie Stopes. They've had their own problems in the UK. They have had problems in different African countries. They have in fact been banned and suspended at different times across the different African countries. And yet, because this is all things happening outside of the Canadian news cycle, it's quite easy for the Canadian taxpayer to miss that an organization like this with such a reputation, with so many problems, they're always on some kind of PR campaign or some kind of PR cleanup activity. Why is it that they are now the recipient of a lot of Canadian funding, a lot of Canadian money, a lot of Canadian dollars? check out what your government is doing. Marie Stopes International, Pathfinder, which again, they are not a Canadian organization. They are very much involved with all kinds of things that have to do with population control. In fact, it was the other time I realized that Pathfinder International helped the Gates Foundation to roll out one of the major population control campaigns that has been done in Africa in the last couple of years. They helped the Gates Foundation roll out the so-called Sayana Press, which was invented by Pfizer or which had been put out by Pfizer. But Pathfinder International, anyone who knows Pathfinder and who knows their history will also know that they've been very much involved with the eugenics movement all the way, going all the way back. The Canadian government is cooperating with them and collaborating with them. The Clinton Foundation, again, they are not Canadian very obviously, but they are a partner to the Canadian funding stream or the Canadian International Development Agency. People should know that Canada coming into African countries and doing aid, I know it sounds nice, and anyone who is trying to imagine it would just imagine some, good Canadians going out, setting up schools, building, nice facilities for Africans in different communities. But it's actually not like that. This is all Canadian money going into the pockets of corporate organizations. Yes, they are in fact corporate organizations. Some of these London-based and American-based organizations. That's how aid, that's the cold truth about aid. It's money going into the pockets of people that are already wealthy. It's for some of them, it's actually like a new market that is starting off and the Canadian money flowing right through and they going out to Africa and deciding what needs doing or what they want to do. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the African organizations. So meanwhile, the African organizations themselves, they are not involved directly in any way. If there is any African organizations involved, they are only like a tertiary provider of any of the aid, if that ever is even the case. The Canadians themselves may only just be running a small office or a small outfit in the African capital, but the people who achieve or who go out to carry out these so-called feminist foreign policies Western organizations, mostly American, British, and some other European organizations. So it's money flowing from the Canadians to those who are already very wealthy, putting their CEOs and the presidents of these organizations into six-figure salaries. They have executives who are living really well, and all on the force of the fact that they are doing work, they are doing good work in Africa on behalf of the Canadians. So that's an area I think the Canadians must and should ask for transparency on. Who gets the Canadian money, who is using the Canadian money, who is living on the Canadian money. Some of those people, you see them at African capitals, they are living in really nice hotels. At one time, in fact, I remember just something personal that I had been doing some work in an African country, and I happened to have something to do at the Hilton Hotel at one of these African capitals that I will not be naming. It was shocking to me, the number of Western donor organization staff who were living, they were actually living at this Hilton, this African capital. So it's the force of the money and the power of the money, and all of this money, mind you, is all taxpayer money. And the people who have given it have no idea that this is exactly how their money is rolled out.
Uju, you mentioned in your response, you used the term population control. And that reminds us that while Canada's feminist foreign policy and our feminist international assistance may be something new, the population control movement is not new. It has its roots in the first half of the 20th century, in misguided progressive movements. As you reminded us, it has its roots in various campaigns that were associated with eugenics. It saw major foundations in the 50s and 60s obsessed with bringing the gospel of population control to China and India and Africa. But the view seemed to be that you could solve the problems of China, India, and Africa if there were a lot fewer Chinese, Indians, and Africans. Does that thinking still exist?
Oh, in fact, I think that thinking is the core of many of the projects that are being done. This is eugenics and population control that we have long since meant to have been rejected. All of these ideas, people agree that you do not eliminate the poor, you do not eliminate the disabled, you shouldn't at least do that. So people frown at the idea of population control, like, especially when it comes to having to remove and eliminate people who are either poor or black or brown people. You know, we hear all of these things that it's been rejected. But it's really what they've done is that they've recycled this idea or this ideology. They have recycled it, put it through the washer. They have perfumed it with the good language and the nice language of progress and women empowerment, and you know, it would help you unlock potentials, as I heard in one TED Talk show that was done by the wife of Bill Gates. So they have this, you know, almost like a florid language that they've used to boost up this whole new idea that is actually an old and washed off idea. And now they've brought it back and they've made it the very core of a lot of the well-funded, extensive projects that we see in Africa now. Now, you mentioned China. People who have followed the situation in China as far as population control is concerned would know that the Chinese are now going through a very critical time when their population, we are seeing an imbalance within population, and you know, in terms of male and female, there is a great imbalance. They are seeing demographic winter happening in some parts of society. They are seeing the so-called upside down pyramid, where you have a child who has to take care of 2 parents and then who has to take care of 4 grandparents. There are all these things that we have seen. They've tried it. It failed in China. Of course, it failed in India, where there is a very serious problem of large numbers of girls being killed, the so-called femicide. They're killing unborn babies that are girls. Now they bring it to Africa, where our donors, all they see is the number of people being born in Africa, is the fertility rate of the African women, without even bothering to ask the Africans what they think or what they feel about their population, about family, how they conceive all of these things. Our donors are coming in with the same population control ideas that have been rejected, but only just wrapped up in a whole new campaign, and they are making it seem palatable, or they're making it seem like something good and something that is a mark of progress.
And how does this agenda look at street level when it's delivered in an African community? What does it look like?
Right. So in the past, we had, when I was growing up in Nigeria, whenever we had to deal with donors, or we had any contact with donors, it would look like this. A school is built. Children are able to get books thanks to a donor, a Western donor. Children are able to get scholarship thanks to a Western donor. Sometimes our donors would help to build a hospital or bring in a medical equipment. But that's not really the situation now, at least as far as my own travel, I have seen on my own travels. When you now go through the various African cities, towns, and villages, you would see sexual and reproductive health and rights projects that it would be thanks to the UK government or the Canadian government. Of course, in this particular case, that we're interested in what the Canadian government is doing, particularly in African towns and villages. Just anecdotally, and even, anybody can verify the facts. There was a project that was started off by the Canadian government in Ethiopia. It's meant to be a nutrition program that is targeting adolescent girls. But when you read the fine print of this project, nutrition program is meant to be good, right? Actually wrong, because you read this to see what exactly is this nutrition program going on in Ethiopia. It's actually the Canadian government trying to target girls by offering food, some kind of food program for children in school and out of school. But when they gather together, you find out that they are given the so-called adolescent-friendly family planning. So, and then it's comprehensive sexuality education. This is what our donors do that you will find is really insidious, really tricky. It's a horrible way of delivering things. If you have nothing to hide, and if you have the best of intentions, you don't offer food just so that you will then give what societies are rejecting. A lot of African parents and in a lot of African villages, they do not want strangers coming in to talk to their children about sexual matters, especially with the fact that how sexuality or intimacy is seen in different African societies is not the same way it is seen in Western societies. The Africans have a completely different way of viewing these things, different standards, the way they see family, the way they see marriage, the way they see their children as far as growing up and learning the morals, responsibilities, what is right and what is wrong. African parents want to teach their children all these things, and then the Canadian government then sponsors these projects that they then bring it in by saying they're offering food or they're offering nutrition programs. And when the children gather at school away from their parents, away from their guardians, the Canadian government is sponsoring for these children to get this particular thing that has now already been conceived in Canada, ready to be delivered to African girls. There are also situations like some of the partners that Canada is right now just embracing so tightly, like Marie Stopes International, who I had mentioned earlier that they've been involved in so many scandals. But there was a point in time the Kenyans were rejecting Marie Stopes. This was actually just a few years ago when people were calling for the arrest of some of the Marie Stopes executives. Why? Because they realized that Marie Stopes went into schools, and the allegation was that Marie Stopes was giving contraception to children without parental consent. Now you wonder that an organization like this that is sponsored constantly by Canada right now, and Canada is one of their larger donors, is going into African countries and they are failing communities and they are causing outrage. There have also been cases where Marie Stopes has been caught or at least accused of illegal abortions in parts of society where abortion is illegal. There are also the different situations that we find that some of these organizations like International Planned Parenthood Federation, Marie Stopes International, even this organization called IPAS that is also American, they are very much engaged in trying to lobby and advocate. And yes, even in some cases, we hear allegations of bribery occurring where they are trying to get to African legislators and African parliamentary members by offering them things, taking them to hotels, treating them well. Why? All because they are heading towards, pushing them towards the legalization of abortion. Where do they get that money from? They are getting the money from the countries, the wealthy Western countries that are sponsoring them. These are some of the ways that I believe that Canadian taxpayer dollars is going. So if you are a Canadian taxpayer and you are thinking that the money that you are giving that is finally ending up in foreign aid, if you are thinking that is helping some child in Africa have a decent meal or get a decent education, no, think more like your money might in fact be going to bribing government officials in African countries, parliamentary members in African countries, traditional rulers. These organizations, these so-called partners that Canadians or the Canadian government is working with, they are being strengthened by the money that they're getting from the government, and then they are wreaking havoc in some of the African countries.
Uju, Canada and the United Nations and other Western nations now regularly proclaim that abortion is a human right. Do you see abortion as a human right?
absolutely not. But it's not even just what I see abortion as, or whether abortion is a human right or not. Let's just look at the African continent and how the African countries view abortion, and why, for example, it has been such a problem, even for those who are lobbying for abortion. It's been so difficult for them to make headway in African countries. I had mentioned earlier that some of the beliefs that the Africans have, or different African countries and communities have about abortion, go right back to cultural views and values. A lot of the African cultures, for example, believe in, the bloodlines, that I am the product of my ancestors and I carry the blood forward of my ancestors. So imagine how societies like that believe so strongly in the fact that we, in the present, we are connecting the past to the future generations. So the past generations to the future generations through the human life will then completely reject abortion, because you see that as a break in that kind of blood lineage. The Africans also believe so strongly in the fact that the baby in the womb is already alive. The baby in the womb is human, even without the benefit of science, even without ultrasound. I see and hear this among people who have never seen an ultrasound, who cannot afford to do an ultrasound, but they already talk about their babies as if their baby is very much alive. We name our children sometimes before birth. We also have names that reflect the beauty of life, the gratitude that the family or the parents of this child and the grandparents of the child have about the baby being alive, about the baby's, the grace and the hope that the baby is bringing. So even with all the difficulties that people may be going through, there is such a high value that is attached to the human life. So we have continued to reject this idea that abortion is in any way a good thing. Abortion kills. Abortion is an attack of the most vulnerable. This is not just my view. I am talking about the view of the community where I come from. Now imagine that entire nations are thinking this way. And so we then come out to the world stage, the United Nations, where definitely the Western countries continue to bring up the fact that abortion should be a human right, a universal human right. But the African countries and other countries continue to reject this idea. No, abortion is not a human right. Abortion is not in any way universally accepted. As a matter of fact, there are more countries in Africa that reject abortion outright than those that accept it. There are about 4 countries in Africa that have what you call abortion on demand. The rest of them are saying no to abortion. Even when people try to bring in abortion, the so-called abortion rights through one way or the other, people keep rejecting it. So no, abortion is not a universal human right. It has been rejected many times. The idea that abortion could ever be taken as a human right is not a new thing. We've heard it before. They keep bringing it up every time at the United Nations, and every time in the same way it is rejected. So the fact that Canada has that view, it should actually not affect the way they treat African countries that have taken a completely opposing view to it. And as a matter of fact, whenever anybody comes into an African country and sponsors abortion or anything that has to do with abortion, this is the way it is seen by society, that country, that Western country or that Western donor is spending money trying to find ways to kill our younger generation. That's the way it's seen. And that's the way that I have always known it. That's the way that a lot of people think about it. And that is our policy position anyway.
Would you mention poverty as a factor? And that gets us back to, I guess, the most important question. What should we be doing instead of promoting abortion, foisting abortion, changing African culture to normalize abortion? If we really wanted to help women and girls in Africa, how could we be spending our money better?
I will be so biased to say that education is the way out of poverty. It is the lifeline. It is what people know in African countries. Everybody, or most people, want to go to school. Most people want to get better training, better education, so that they can actually live and support them, live on their own and support themselves and support their families and bring their families out of the clutches of poverty. We want better education, and that is the one thing that is lacking across the continent. The UNICEF puts out numbers every year of the number of children who don't have access to education, children who should be educated and they're not being educated. And in the African continent, every year, consistently, we are having the highest number of children who should be enrolled in school and who aren't getting educated. Children who are even of primary school age. Once a child is at primary school age and is not getting any kind of education, that child is set for poverty for life already. Talk less of the secondary school and, of course, trying to get people into higher education that can then get them the skills they need to get gainful employment, to get themselves out of poverty, to get their families and support their families out of poverty. So anybody who is of goodwill and who wants to help any community in Africa, you want to see them thrive, you want to see them not dependent on your aid, you have to offer them education. You have to offer them a better way or an easier way for their children to get into school, and that is where our problem lies. Then, of course, with education, you have a few other things that will make our lives better, like healthcare. We have to be alive to be able to get educated, so helping to strengthen our healthcare system and our healthcare facilities and institutions, getting the judicial systems working, getting the law enforcement systems working so that people are actually safe within their own communities, trying to get rid of terrorism in the African countries. As people who follow the news may already know, that in different places, like in my country, we have had problems in more recent years of terrorism. How do we get out of all of that and be able to stay secure within our own communities and be able to thrive within our families and be able to stay healthy and then pursue education and pursue training? That's all possible, but it will only be possible if the international community is keyed in with us or is tuned in and listening to exactly what people within those communities want and what they are asking for. Abortion is not the way people. In fact, many Africans turn up their noses when you tell them that, some Western country has made this large budget for sexual and reproductive health and rights. People wonder, well, can they see that we don't even have food to eat? Who is talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights? But it's interesting that our Western donors, many of our Western donors have already made their priorities, and because many of them haven't lived in our towns, our villages, our countries, they have no idea whatsoever what it is like, being a little child in an African city or in an African village or in an African town. And then, of course, they have absolutely no way of reconciling what life is like in an Africa, living in Africa with trying to get out of poverty. And I think that's what really leads them to this point where they're offering us all these things that we haven't asked for and that we don't want. And many times we reject, by the way. So it's almost like an exercise in wasting money, that if you are bringing sexual and reproductive health and rights to a community that hasn't asked for it, the most likely thing that will happen, as we've seen happen many times with regards to many of the African projects, is a waste of money, is that nobody takes it and nobody accepts it. But that money is already spent and it's taxpayers' money. What Africans really need and what we continue to ask for is good education, and not the so-called comprehensive sexuality education. When it comes down to it, what the Africans are always asking of and always asking for is safe delivery of their babies, and not the so-called safe abortion. So what the language that has already been set out in the West, what it tells us is not always, in fact, most times is really not what the Africans are asking for.
Uju, when you said that Africans aren't excited by our abortion agenda, that led me to wonder, well, who is excited by it? Because governments wouldn't go to the lengths that our government has gone to talk about it, to promote it, to mention it in every announcement. Recently, for example, Uju, I noticed that we had an announcement about Canada's aid to the developing world for the pandemic. And sure enough, even in that announcement, we were talking about help fighting COVID-19, there was a reference to this agenda, this so-called maternal health agenda, which is really the abortion agenda. And I wonder whether the demographic that gets excited, the community that gets excited, is back here in Canada. that the government isn't, as governments sometimes do, pitching its aid agenda to a group that it's targeted at home. And that maybe a big part of the education is not just for aid professionals, but for Canadians too. That we need to think much more carefully about what's happening in Africa, the consequences and unintended consequences of Canadian assistance.
Right, so what you had referenced there, the COVID-19 relief fund that the Canadian government had joined with, I think, 59 other countries to make a statement about COVID-19 and COVID-19 funding, it was so telling. It was so telling as to who is excited. Who's excited about sexual and reproductive health and rights? Who is excited about easy access to abortion? That at a time like this, in this year where there has been a pandemic, many more people have tuned in to see what's happening around the world. How are people responding? How is your own country responding to this? People have had to, take account of what we have, what any country has in order to be able to live through a pandemic like this. From the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries had to count again to know how many ventilator support systems do we have in our healthcare system, for example. How many intensive care units can we have and support in this country? Because, of course, many people who were in a bad situation with coronavirus had to be admitted into intensive care units. At that point in time, David, that was when we realized that there are, in fact, up to 10 African countries without a single ventilator system that could support somebody who needs the ventilator. We found out that there were many African countries that didn't even have intensive care unit or any way to support people who need ICU care. So at a point where the incredible gaps within our healthcare system got exposed, in this year there has been a pandemic, people are coming out to talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights. The Canadian government cannot be serious about this. It's unbelievable, and what a shock. But also it's quite telling as to what an ideologue does, that at a time when the world is prostrate on the floor trying to struggle to survive, that someone will be talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights and how more money should be put to it.
Uju, it sounds like this program that we're talking about in Africa, it's very ambitious, and it's centered on the most sensitive of sectors, the care, the medical care that we provide to people. You have to wonder whether enough thought has been given to unintended consequences, negative side effects. And you get to this in Strings Attached, your very powerful film on this subject. Can you speak to some of these unintended consequences? Right.
We went to some villages. This was actually in Uganda. The video that we had and interviews that we had made for Strings Attached, the documentary that I released a few years ago. We went to villages and we saw these women who were ready to talk to us. And most of them could not even speak English, David, but with the use of translators, we were able to find out that an organization, a Western organization, came into their village. They were giving contraception. Not only were they giving contraception, but they were telling women that these contraceptions had close to no side effects whatsoever. But what did we see? We saw women who were suffering all kinds of side effects. We spoke to doctors who had been community doctors who had dealt with women, African women in villages who have had side effects that none of them ever expected, none of them ever wanted. Some woman also told us how somebody locked them in a room. This was the allegation she made. She said when they got there, they showed them an IUD, and the women in this village were saying they didn't want the IUD, but somebody locked them up in the room and eventually ended up putting the IUDs into them. So if you think about this, somebody going into into an African village, you are giving women, you are coming on a mobile clinic, you are giving women something like the IUD that requires almost a surgical process to put in and remove, and then you're leaving. This was what had happened to these women. They came, they gave for free of charge the IUD, gave it to several women, and by the time the side effects set in, it was almost impossible for them to have it removed, because some of them were bleeding non-stop, some of them were suffering all kinds of ailments. They were having discharge, they were talking about weight loss, there were all these things that had happened to them. One of them said she had almost like a partial paralysis, like one side of her body, she said she couldn't feel anything. Some of them had horrible issues with their marriage following that, of course, with all kinds of health issues coming up for them that they didn't expect. These are poor women, and there was absolutely no way for them to have the IUDs removed. Eventually, some ended up in a hospital where they were charged to have it removed. So imagine someone gives you something for free of charge, and then to have it removed, if you don't want it anymore, you are having to pay for it. But then on further questioning, one of the women said she knew who came, because of course I'm speaking about them like it's some Western organization, and we asked her, who was it that came to your village on a mobile clinic and did this to you? She said it was Mary Stopes. They may not understand English, but they knew what the name of the organization was. They saw the logo, they would recognize it, they would point it out anytime, any day. But there was also something else that we found had happened. In addition to the IUDs that were given, there was some other group of women that were given Norplant. And at the time when this was happening, if anybody knows about Norplant, once it came on the market, had so many complications in Western market. People had sued the company. Many people had asked for settlement from the pharmaceutical companies. So the Norplant was having so many problems. And then the pharmaceutical companies, in conjunction with the sexual and reproductive health and rights organizations from the West, then took it to African villages, and they gave it to women in rural areas who had no way whatsoever of suing the company, of getting, taking recourse in the judicial system. So as far as my research is concerned, I have searched and I've gone through various African institutions and various African countries. I still have not found one single person who was able to make any claim or get any settlement from a pharmaceutical company that has given them contraception that then ended up causing them lots of health complications and problems. And this is something that not only the women are telling us they're experiencing, it's something that people within the healthcare institution in various African countries are seeing happening along the pathway of Western donors and Western organizations whose primary job is going out sterilizing people. So you can almost see that as a kind of a forced sterilization. Definitely, it's false advertising. They are destroying lives, and many times they come in a mobile clinic and then they disappear. So these are things that almost border on human rights abuse. For those who think and talk about human rights, it could definitely not be a good thing that a Western organization comes into an African village or comes into an African town and they have access to women and they are giving women pharmaceutical products that have already been rejected in the West or have had problems in the West, but then they quickly then make completely disappear, that the women are not even able to get back to them and have the problem sorted. It's a problem, and any Western taxpayer should be thinking and asking themselves, is it a good thing that the money you have given or the tax that you've given that you think is going into making people's lives better, is it a good thing that your money may actually be ending up destroying lives, real lives, in places in various villages and towns far away from where you are? So imagine if this happened to your own daughter in Canada, that your child went out to somewhere and then someone had some kind of pharmaceutical product, some kind of pharmaceutical device put into her body, and then this product happened to be something that in some other part of the world has already been rejected. These are things that are unheard of. These are things that in Western countries, parents will actually be, rather upset. People will be asking for somebody to hold responsible. This is happening all across the African continent in the pathway of those who call themselves sexual and reproductive health and rights organizations, like Marie Stopes International, like International Planned Parenthood Federation. Again, I remind you, these are organizations that are large collaborators and partners to the Canadian government.
Uju, you've said that this agenda doesn't excite Africans. So who is the government of Canada trying to excite or to please? It sounds a little as if they're trying to please their own block of voters, maybe the media, and maybe their supporters and like-minded allies in the UN and some of the major foundations that also see abortion as the solution to all of Africa's problems.
Right. So we've seen the Canadian administration, the current administration, doing all of this without listening to us, without hearing the African side of things, without seeking our opinions. And then you look a little closer and you find activists within Western countries, like in Canada, who are excited and who are applauding the Canadian government for what they are doing. We go to the United Nations and you see the people who surround the Canadian, the Canadian diplomats and the Canadian mission there at the United Nations, people who are speaking to them and communicating with them. Again, they are activists. I just like to remind people that I think it was only a year ago, if that, when in Vancouver, Women Deliver, which is an organization, a feminist organization, held one of their meetings or one of their conferences out there. And the Canadian Prime Minister had come to that event and he made a promise, he made an announcement at that event. That really captures, David, what you were saying. The response to the Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister's announcement will show you exactly who is excited by all of these things happening, because immediately he made the announcement to the feminist agenda, the kind of money that Canada was then going to infuse on top of everything else that the Canadian government had already done up to that point. These women and activists were excited, they were jumping up, they were happy with what was going on. Meanwhile, when you go to African countries, you will be hard-pressed to find even a few people or a handful of people who know exactly what Canada is spending on in an African country. So the Canadian government spends more than $2 billion every year on aid in Africa for various things, for various projects. So how is it that spending that amount of money and putting in even a lot of hundreds of millions of dollars into the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights, that it doesn't make it to any of the African national news? People don't know about it. People are not excited about it. It's not being announced on TV. We're not excited about it. If it was something that had to do with, say, for example, scholarship, or the Canadian government is building a school or hospitals, or that could have made better news. That will actually make better press in Africa, and people will talk about it. People will applaud Canada. But the Africans at the moment, they are not applauding Canada. Definitely not for the so-called feminist agenda, and also not for the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda that has now essentially been carried out very successfully, if you like, by the current administration. The only people applauding the Canadian government, the only people excited about what the Canadian government is doing, are the activists, the radical activists in the West. And that's because Canada and the Canadian government is achieving their dream across the African continent.
I said at the outset that one of the problems when there's great pressure to spend vast amounts of money is that there's insufficient attention paid to how well that money is spent. And you've got to believe that's a problem facing us in Africa. Uju, can you point to some examples where Canadian money, Canadian taxpayers' money, may have been wasted?
The Canadian government now putting such emphasis and effort and priority on sexual and reproductive health and rights and everything that comes with it, the comprehensive sexuality education, all the contraception programs that they are spending so much money on. Things like condoms that are being shared in schools under the so-called adolescent-friendly family planning programs. Just a couple of years ago, this is only one small example of how Western money could actually get wasted in an African country. A couple of years ago, the Ethiopian government had a recall on 69 million condoms worth $2 million. So this is a lot of condoms. This is a lot of money that isn't African money. It is Western taxpayers' money. And all of this the condoms that were recalled were put in a pile, literally put in a pile and set on fire, because they said it didn't meet the standards, it didn't meet the standard of elasticity, there were holes in it, there were problems with the different batches. 69 million condoms donated by Western donors, put up in a pile like trash, which it is, and set on fire, and all of this was completely burnt. This is money, $2 million, that could have gone into a community to provide them with, say, for example, drinking water, that in the country, that same country, Ethiopia, where all these condoms were burnt, you have just about 33% of the people who don't even have access to clean drinking water. In a place where 33% of the people don't have access to clean drinking water, imagine that $2 million worth of condom is being burned in a pile. That's what happens when Canadian government or any other government would put in money to giving people what they haven't asked for, what they don't want, what they're not clamoring for, just because you have your own priorities. It may just end up with money being flushed away or with money just being burnt away. There have also been cases where last year Marie Stopes in Uganda had to have a major recall of about, I think, 4 million condoms. They had a major recall of condoms. We don't know what they did with it. But if you think about it, that Marie Stopes is an organization that is sponsored by the Canadian government, and then they're having recall of millions of condoms over a period of time, what does that mean that has happened to your money? It means that money that was donated has not in fact reached the community where it was donated to or where it was donated for. People are wasting money. Women are giving contraception that they haven't asked for, they don't need, or they don't want. I had talked about the IUD that we saw women in Uganda trying to remove out of their bodies. That all of this is Western donors' money. It ends up in places and in situations where people take it because they're coerced or they're lied to or they're convinced to take it, but after a little while they decide they don't want it anymore. At the end, we are having rejection of these things that then lead to just a complete waste of money, because money that could have been used for the real development of a community is being used for the priority of the donor, and of course it ends up in a trash can somewhere, or it ends up being burnt in a pile like we saw in Ethiopia.
Uju, we've talked about many things today. And while you're obviously an expert on Africa, you also follow trends in the West very carefully, including in Canada. What advice would you have for us if we are to get our aid onto a better track? If we're to get our aid onto a track that actually helps people in Africa and aims to end African dependence on aid? What should we be doing?
I'm so grateful, David, for this question, because it really will give me an opportunity right now to appeal to the public and the Canadian taxpayers who are people of goodwill, who are people who genuinely just want to see good done, who are not in any way more interested in ideology than the well-being of people in different parts of Africa. I would like to suggest that the Canadian taxpayers should pay more attention to exactly what the government is doing. You should be asking more of your government. You should be asking for more transparency when billions of dollars are concerned being spent under the umbrella of foreign aid. I think that the government owes the people an explanation as to how that money is being spent, where it's being spent, and the outcome of it. The separation that we normally get is the fact that when the money leaves the Western donors, the shores of the Western donor, it goes to Africa, and nobody on the Western side knows exactly what has happened to the money. So there's a huge divide, and nobody, takes the time to see exactly where that money ends up. The Canadian public should be asking their governments about aid, foreign aid, what is going on. You should be asking about what the Africans are doing with the money, how the Africans are receiving this money, how the people are being affected by it, if women's lives are being destroyed, if families are being destroyed, if marriages are being affected, simply for the fact that a Western donor has come into that community and they are infusing money where the people have not asked. I think that people should talk to their members of parliament, if possible, and put some pressure upon the members of parliament to question the Canadian government and the Canadian current administration as to what they are doing, how they are doing it. I had watched some kind of exchange that happened in the Canadian Parliament a while back, where an MP was asking this kind of question about Marie Stopes, for example, and what happened with the way the Canadian government was funding this organization that has had so many scandals. And it was a shock to me as an African how condescending the foreign minister, the Canadian foreign minister, was towards this member of parliament. I think that more people should be asking the same question, and I thought that this MP had it right and was on the right track to ask these very targeted questions as to the fact that if an organization has had scandals, and if an organization has been suspended in some African country, or they're being accused of illegal abortion or some illegal activities, then the Canadians must stop funding that organization. There should be transparency. There should be accountability. The Canadians should be asking and following the money to where it's going, because only then can it really affect in a positive way the people it's being sent to. Only then can you pick out the problems, and only then would you be that Canada and the donor who is listening to people, just as he said at the beginning, who listens to people, who is humble, and who is more interested in a transitional kind of program where Canada does the aid and leaves the way so that these people can thrive. I really appeal to the Canadians to do better with aid, because you're already being so generous. It would be a shame if your generosity is not really getting to the point of improving lives, but rather harming lives in the different parts of the world. You should do better. You should demand more from your government and the foreign aid programs that they have in place.
Transparency, accountability, following the money. We couldn't ask for better advice than that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Uju.
Thank you, David, for having me. It's been a wonderful opportunity to discuss with you and to address the Canadian public. Thank you.
I hope that one of your takeaways from this has been how important it is to hear genuine and compelling African voices when it comes to understanding African development. And for me, the first voice that I listened to is that of Obianuju Ekeocha. And I hope you'll join me in following her on social media, following the documentaries that she produces and the books that she writes, because hers is a voice that we need to hear. We started this discussion examining the possibility that Canada might be practicing a form of coercive diplomacy in Africa. And we framed that with the experience that Canada is having of China's the coercive diplomacy that China is employing here in Canada. And as we've talked, a number of very salient points stand out. Of course, one of the main way that China delivers its coercive diplomacy is through its economic leverage and pressure. We're afraid to say things or not say things because we're afraid of the economic impact that it will feel from a vengeful China. And it strikes me from what Uju has told us that the economic clout of Western countries may be opening the doors and making Africans more inclined to go along, albeit reluctantly, with our abortion agenda. So that's one similarity. It's also true that China has used the United Nations and the World Health Organization, as we've seen recently to help apply pressure to Western nations. It enlists the help of the United Nations, which is eager to support China. It certainly has enlisted the support of the WHO to get its own messages across. And this is another form of influence. But who have we enlisted as our partner in our agenda in Africa? But the UN, which inserts references and support for abortion in a variety of programs that you might think had nothing to do with abortion. And the third similarity that strikes me is that our efforts get right down to controlling the kind of language that is used. It was shocking for many people to realize that in describing the gross abuse of Muslim Uyghur people in effectively concentration camps in Western China, the Chinese government refers to this under the benign term of re-education. But when we talk about an initiative that will remove from the population a whole generation of African boys and girls through abortion, we describe this as a healthcare initiative. So that sense that we're engaging in coercive diplomacy is stronger in me as a result of my conversation with Uju. This leads to a consideration of what can we do about it. Now, I won't deny that that's a daunting question. The Canada's feminist international assistance policy, which is, you'll recall, former Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland explained has abortion at its heart, is something of a runaway freight train. Already great amounts of money, we've talked about hundreds of millions of dollars, as much perhaps as $600 or $700 million a year in future years, will be directed to this. So it is a daunting project to oppose, but I think oppose it we must. And one of the problems, of course, is that abortion is in some way the third rail of Canadian politics. And as we've seen party after party, now virtually all the opposition parties are afraid to raise it as an issue, which is unfortunate in a country that values, or says that it values, free debate. But what else have we learned? We've learned that this may not be good foreign policy, it may not be good aid policy, because it involves us telling the Africans what they need rather than trying to listen to what the Africans might tell us about what they need. And it's also, as Uju has pointed out so dramatically, very often a waste of money. So one of the things you can do is get mad. And you can go back and review and study this and speak to your members of parliament so that at some level and somewhere this discussion begins. And Canadians begin to think about an initiative that is wrong, that is wasteful, and that is giving us a reputation in Africa for being a bully, for being superior, and is diminishing the goodwill that Canada has built up over generations. We've dealt with some difficult issues today, but I think you'll agree that they've been important issues. And I'm tremendously grateful to Uju, who's been such a patient and compelling advocate for a different way in Africa. I'm also very thankful to the team that has enabled this conversation to take place. And finally, I'm very grateful to you for being part of it. Thank you.